Hi, I'm Don from Don Drones On. I mentioned last month that the public's comments on the proposed changes to the RPAS regulations here in Canada are now available online. Well, since then, I've had a chance to download them all, do some sifting and sorting, and most importantly, I've read them all. Yes, that's right. Some really interesting gems in there, so let's get into it. You know it's going to be a long video when there's an agenda. Well, I'm going to start with some statistics, then look at what organizations submitted comments, some common themes. I'm going to share some unique or intriguing comments, okay, the funny ones, and then we're going to go through some interesting points from various sources. And I'm going to round this off by pointing out something that I completely missed in the regulations. It's a lot to share, so let's jump right in. So to help with the analysis of all these comments, the first thing I did was download them all and put them in an Excel spreadsheet. Having the comments in a spreadsheet helped me to do some simple analysis, note some common themes, and keep track of interesting points being raised. In total, there were 311 comments submitted across the various sections of the proposed regulations. But that doesn't really reflect the sheer volume of these comments. Here's a perspective based on word count. In total, there were almost 100,000 words in the comments, which is absolutely incredible. According to Google, 100,000 words is the typical length of a full-size novel. And this explains why my eyes are so sore. In terms of language, it was interesting and honestly a bit disturbing to see that only 4% of the comments were submitted in French. Now, I'm not bilingual, so what I did was I translated those comments to English, and then I could include them in my analysis. Comments from individuals had their actual names removed on the public website, and these represented 59% of the comments. You could also submit your comments anonymously, which was an additional 10%. So assuming the anonymous folks were also individuals, which makes sense, that means over 2/3 of the comments were from regular folks on the street. I'm guessing that this is a huge change from previous consultations where the material was less well publicized and you really had to be in the circle to even know about the proposals. This is a healthy improvement. The remaining comments came from 31 unique organizations shown here. And if you scan down the list, you'll see what I call, well, the usual suspects. Certainly no surprise that we see comments from search and rescue or first responder organizations, DPAC, of course, and Indro Robotics. I was surprised to see Aerial Evolution use their old name of Unmanned Systems for their comments. But there you go, that was their choice. And last but not least, we see Volatus Aerospace, a big name in the commercial drone arena. So those are the usual suspects, but check out these ones. The Canadian Air Traffic Control Association, representing air traffic controllers. DJI. Well, maybe not a big surprise to see DJI make comments, but there it is. The National Airlines Council of Canada, representing Air Canada, WestJet, and a few other airlines. Nav Canada put in some comments. And even Rogers and TELUS, mobile phone companies, put in comments on the proposed regulations. I'll share some tidbits from some of these organizations. Not every one of them, or we would be here all day and all night, but a sampling. That's not to slight the organizations or individuals I don't focus on. I just can't go over absolutely everything. As I was reading through the comments, and I did read through every single one of them, some common themes were quickly apparent, and I tagged them in my spreadsheet. Certainly the biggest common theme that came through loud and clear, and this was submitted by multiple individuals and some organizations too, was that RC aircraft should be treated as a separate category of RPAS. The safety record of the hobby, the practical elements of flying RC aircraft, such as keeping them in visual line of sight, the fixed club locations. RC aircraft are not drones, and painting them with the same brush of regulations just does not make any sense. So 35 comments out of 311 had that element stated either explicitly or implied in some way. And while this is not a popularity contest, I hope Transport Canada recognizes that there's an issue here that really needs to be addressed. Another theme that was quite prevalent is that the proposed increases, either for registration or for SFOC fees, are too high, and particularly too high for hobbyists. I saw 30 comments related to this. Another one, and this was not something that I had looked at much at all, because it doesn't really fall into my wheelhouse of recreational drones, and that was the new requirement for these more complex operations to have a medical certification. I saw 18 comments, some from associations and some from individuals, stating the new requirements were excessive. One thing that many people focused on is the way it is worded. If you ever had any form of diagnosed mental illness or disability, you were basically outlawed from participating in these complex operations. Moving on, another theme was that the regulations are too complex. In some cases, the comment was not only too complex, but also that the rules were too prescriptive. 12 people pointed out that the new extended VLOS rule that says that the spotter must have their advanced certification was excessive. Some said they should have at least their basic. Others said as long as they were suitably trained, that was good enough. And finally, the fact that foreign pilots need an SFOC, and now that SFOC is going to have a fee associated with it, well, that was pointed out as not being appropriate and something that should be fixed. And also the fact that any commercial operations by foreign pilots need to go through the new Commercial Air Services regulations seemed odd to many. In all fairness, some people supported that to protect Canadian jobs, but most commenters were opposed to it. So those were the most common items that showed up in my analysis. But there were also some comments that were unique or intriguing in their own right. So let's go through a few of those. This one made me laugh. They called TC out for taking credit for the fantastic safety record within the RPAS community. Transport Canada said, the existing Part 9 of the CARS has created a strong safety baseline with no fatalities or serious injuries since coming into force in 2019. Well, this person pointed out that there was a long history of safety before the regulations, and that the culture of safety is pre-existent and established, especially among hobbyists, and the implication that Part 9 created it, well, it might be seen as a form of cultural appropriation. Good catch. The new complex operations involving low-risk BVLOS include a lot of references to risk assessments and ensuring the risk is extremely low. So this person commented, why is it acceptable to drive an automobile, the most likely cause of death for a person under 45, to your site after proving that the drone flight has 10 to the minus 5 chance of causing a fatality? Do general aviation pilots need to prove each of their flights' risk percentage? No, they do not. Yeah, we need some balance in these regulations. This was an interesting one related to sub-250 drone pilots needing safety training, and it actually came up in a number of contexts. This person said it should be mandatory that everyone know the basic airspace regulations and be familiar with applications like the NRC Drone Site Selection Tool or NavDrone. And they proposed that a program similar to the FAA's Trust program would help here. Does that sound familiar? Well, maybe they're not aware that the Drone Pilot Association of Canada came out with our safety course recently, and it covers exactly this kind of thing. Basic safety information for all pilots, particularly sub-250 gram drone pilots. And yes, it's very similar to the FAA Trust program, as well as the Basic Competency program in the UK. So there appeared to be one individual who put in comments many times in different sections, sometimes just changing it a bit. And they were clearly having some serious problems with drones in their neighborhood. Unfortunately, the comments came across like rants, even if they were well, had some legitimate underlying concerns. Here are 4 lines that I extracted from one of the very, very long comments. RPAs are akin to dumb bombs when there is a loss of signal or power. Canadian families are being harmed by the recreational use of RPAs. Anyone can be a jerk with a drone and no one will enforce the law. RPAS operations create an environment of fear, causes victims to suffer stress, anxiety, and despair while their home is turned into a war zone. So I don't know what's going on in this person's life. I mean, some of their points are pertinent, such as the lack of enforcement. And clearly, you shouldn't be flying a drone in such a way that you're harassing someone in the neighborhood. I would just suggest that when you put in comments in this manner, so they appear as a rant, your concerns run the risk of being dismissed. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, a number of organizations put together very coherent, detailed responses to the regulations, the proposals. So let's run through a few samples. We'll start with NAV Canada, which was kind of an interesting one to read. The NAV Canada guys said they need clarity on who could authorize first responder activities within an emergency security perimeter. This related to the new 900.08 regulation, and I'll talk about that towards the end. Basically, what they're saying is they've had situations where people claim to be flying a drone as part of an emergency response, but they clearly have not coordinated with whoever's in charge of that emergency situation. So NAV Canada wanted some clarity on how to determine who gets to authorize these first responder kinds of actions. Good point. And this one was kind of interesting because it's related to some of the changes related to carrying hazardous materials. Does air traffic control need to be advised if an RPA is carrying hazardous materials in controlled airspace? Apparently, crewed aircraft do have to declare that. They also shared this third point that they have observed a noticeable increase in what they described as on-airport RPA requests. In other words, requests for flying not only in controlled airspace, but actually on and around the actual airport facility. Their comment is that specialized training should be in place for these operators to ensure good communications, good understanding of the risks, and better coordination with the facility. And then this one was just quietly dropped into at the very end. I've put it in quotation marks since this is exactly what they said. NAV Canada requests a safety assessment on microdrone use in controlled airspace. That's pretty serious. And this concern about microdrones is echoed by the Canadian Air Traffic Control Association. Here's a few interesting points from their submission. Number 1, they say additional regulations are required for sub-250-gram drones, specifically maximum altitude of 400 feet above ground level in any controlled airspace. That's actually pretty reasonable. But the second point I can't agree with. No flights at any altitude within 3 nautical miles of any airport or within 1 nautical mile of any heliport. I think that's overboard and will overly limit very safe operations like real estate shots or simple low altitude flights in people's backyards. But there you go, that's what they're requesting. Their second major point doesn't have anything to do with sub-250-gram drones. It's more to do with their concerns about people who have their advanced pilot certification but don't seem to understand what controlled airspace is all about, how operations take place around airports, and all that kind of stuff. They're stating that the current advanced pilot certificate does not ensure sufficient knowledge to safely operate in these environments because there's no in-person ground school training required. Exams are not supervised. And they made specific comments about people cheating. And that the flight review, well, presumably it's better than nothing, is not sufficient to test for demonstrated knowledge of operating safely in controlled airspace. So they're suggesting better training. Now let's look at comments from 2 first responder organizations. These ones are from the Canadian Emergency Responders Robotics Association. First, they called for better guidelines related to defining perimeters for the Emergency Security Perimeter Rule, a reasonable request. When they looked at the extended VLOS and sheltered operations stuff, they acknowledged that they were good improvements, but pointed out that the FAA's tactical BVLOS waiver in the US was actually more flexible. I took a quick look at that, just Google it, and I can see why they like it. It's simple, straightforward, and it has the additional stipulation that it be applied only when there is an urgent need to protect human life. On the extended VLOS rule itself, they were one of many who said that requiring the spotter to have their advanced license was overkill. Specific training was enough. These guys and a couple of others pointed out that the new dropping of objects rules wording needed to be improved. As it is worded now, normal rescue items or firefighting tools could be interpreted as hazardous and hence not allowed. I'm sure a simple tweak in the wording will fix this. And finally, they call for an improvement in enforcement. The Canadian Association of Fire Chiefs represented themselves and also two search and rescue organizations, and they credited Indro Robotics with helping them with their submission. And many of these same points were echoed in Indro Robotics' own comments. One of their main points zeroed in on that medical requirement for complex operations, again pointing out that not having previous mental health issues was extremely limiting. They also suggested that the 28-day cannabis use rule for drone pilots should be reviewed in favor of sticking to the more obvious restriction of simply not being impaired at the time of operation. Like the previous organization, they called for a default perimeter distance. These were the key points, but they also had a very solid set of recommendations for improvements to many of the other regulations. The National Airlines Council of Canada. This organization represents Canada's largest passenger air carriers, including Air Canada and WestJet. 2 points jumped out. Firstly, they recommended that a portion of the fees collected by the TCCA should be allocated to improve drone detection systems around airports. Secondly, they urged Transport Canada to improve their public awareness campaigns related to drones. TELUS and Rogers submitted several comments independently, but they seemed reasonably aligned, so excuse me if I've grouped them here. Basically, they made strong technical points related to the new low-risk BVLOS rules. Stuff like allowing access to mobile spectrum for RPAS rather than the current limitations set by ISET, or Industry Canada. They also asked about regulations for the use of drone swarms for inspections and surveillance under certain circumstances. This all points to the fact that technology and innovation is progressing faster than the regulations. DJI's comments were, non-controversial, frankly, and focused on technical elements. They asked for better guidance on how to comply with the expanded 922 standards and made several technical suggestions to improve the new BVLOS and medium RPAS rules. Aerial Evolution, formerly known as Unmanned Systems, put forward a ton of good, detailed recommendations, and I've pulled out just a few here. They supported the notion of better definitions for emergency perimeters. They made a very strong case for reinstating an exemption for RC aircraft pilots operating under the jurisdiction of a club like MAC, and also for the notion of a fleet registration number. They suggested the SFOC costing should be reviewed and recommended it be based upon the initial sale risk level as opposed to the simple categories in the current proposal. They said that the extended VLOS spotter should require only their basic pilot certification rather than their advanced. They encouraged TC to release parts of the regulations earlier in 2024 to provide more time to get ready for the new regulations, and they also recommended that the coming into force date be outside the regular flying season of April to October to minimize a period of non-compliance. An unusual suggestion was that the number of ground schools offering the new, more complex training should actually be restricted, arguing that this would improve the quality of the training. I didn't quite follow the logic on that, but that's what they said. And they echoed others who pointed out the medical requirements issue, where they were too limiting. And like I said earlier, they submitted many, many pages of good detailed recommendations for improvement. Speaking of many pages, I wanted to mention that the Drone Pilot Association of Canada, DPAC, also submitted a solid set of recommendations, 8 pages in fact. Here are some of the key points we made. The extended VLOS spotter should require task training only. The sheltered operations rule should be available to both basic and advanced pilots since the risk level is so low. And it shouldn't be restricted to just buildings and structures. We proposed that foreign pilots, which include a lot of students studying here as well as tourists, should be permitted to register RPAs and attain pilot certifications. And this new commercial air service prohibition should not apply to small RPAs, only larger ones. And I can't believe no one else jumped on this. TC added a specific advertised event exemption for police operations in the service of a public authority. This is Big Brother stuff. I'm all for first responder exemptions or waivers, but only when there's a need for exigency and the purpose is to protect human lives or property. We proposed a number of rules be less prescriptive, including the fitness to fly rule. And over and above everything else in the new regulations, we proposed a massive simplification with the introduction of a situational awareness rule, and proposed a way to safely eliminate the need for FPV spotters. If you want to know more, I encourage you to read our position paper on the DPAC website. Now, I mentioned that I learned something new about the proposals while reading the comments, and here it is. Transport Canada quietly moved 2 existing regulations such that they now apply to all drones, including sub 250 grams. I missed this. So the inadvertent entry into Class F restricted zones is now applicable, as well as the one so many groups talked about, the prohibition from operating any unauthorized drone within an emergency perimeter. Both of these rules will join the 900.06 Don't Do Anything Stupid rule as being applicable to drones of all sizes. With that, I better sign off before my voice completely gives out. Thanks for watching. Safe and happy flying.